Good day, my name is Rick, a man of history and your guide to the past. But today it's going to be my fairly immediate past, as I'm going to be presenting a paper which I gave at a conference at the Royal Armouries in Leeds. It was a really good conference. It was Weapons in Society. This was Weapons in Society 3, which may suggest to you that there were two previous ones and perhaps that there will be a fourth one. And I do recommend, if you are interested in the broad themes and you can get there, you sign up for it for future ones. It was really good. You don't have to be a researcher, just interested in the topic. Though if you are an early career researcher, a PhD student, a heritage professional, somebody that's involved in it, it's worth considering if you want to give a paper. I really enjoyed it. Anyway, my paper, the paper that I gave is entitled, Is It a Real Sword? And it looks at questions of authenticity and realness in historical interpretation for heritage and for public interactions, which is a bit of a mouthful, but rest assured it's got lots of pictures of swords, and more importantly I question the very nature of reality. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you soon.
Good day and welcome. This paper is not a piece of academic work nor based on formal research. Instead, it's based on professional practice and observation from an assortment of different roles that I perform and hats, figurative and literal, which I wear. I'm a heritage professional currently managing a splendid Jacobean historic house museum in Birmingham. I'm a public historian currently writing or failing to write a book whilst providing content for an assortment of other projects. I'm a reenactor and historical interpreter, both as a hobby and as a professional, for museums, heritage and historic sites, and I'm an educator, mostly going to schools and using object and character-led sessions. One of the questions which reenactors hear all the time is that real? Is it real, be it a fire, a baby, food, clothes, or in this case, a sword? Other weapons also apply. I hear it too when I'm at work, both asking about architectural features, but also parts of the collection. And that does include Civil War collection, which includes swords. Finally, it's the first and most repeated question I get asked when I'm interacting with the public, either as a historical interpreter at a museum or when delivering a workshop for a school. So what is realness, and does it really matter? Well, I'll get to the second point in a moment, but for the first point, and speaking personally, I think it depends on what hat I'm wearing as to what real means. I suspect amongst different people with different backgrounds, professions, different disciplines, in different circumstances, environments, that the definition of real, or the understanding of what real is, changes. As a reenactor, a real sword is one which is based on historical example, but whose blades and possibly part of the guard are thickened and blunted to allow me to hit someone safely, or, well, relatively safely. It is a metal stick, after all. As a historical interpreter, somebody who's coming in close contact with the public, or as an educator, a real sword, which is something which is as close to an original as is possible, within certain constraints such as cost and, frankly, the need to balance the number of swords I can fit in my house alongside such mundane trivialities as clothes and myself. That said, for education and interpretation, I also need to make sure I've got swords which are safe to handle, particularly when I'm dressing and arming people in different roles and won't be in perfect control of the person or the things that they're carrying or holding or wearing. As a heritage professional, particularly when we were planning our Civil War interpretation, real meant something completely different. It meant an original piece with provenance to place it in period, and ideally something that was made in one of the many sword mills local to Birmingham and the surrounding areas. However, we also include reproduction swords in the interpretation, something which visitors are encouraged to handle and to interact with. Just to be really super clear, when I talk about a replica or a reproduction, I mean an attempt to create as accurate a copy as possible within the limitations of time, skill, metallurgy, access to originals or sources, space, and most notably time and money. As an example, I have a replica sword in my collection, which is a 16th, 17th century swept hilt rapier made by Armour Class. It's really annoying to draw if you don't get it perfectly placed, and it involved a lot of checking that I really wanted a sharp weapon when ordering. As for reenactment swords, well, these are usually practical weapons. They're built for combat with blunt blades, and normally attention spent to make sure there's no dangerous protrusions which could hurt somebody accidentally. They're pretty universally bigger and heavier than original historical examples, as a thin blade simply cannot be blunted in the same way that a thicker one can. The example here is made by St George Armoury, was an impulse purchase. So when I went for a final fitting for a harness of plate, the armourer Mark Vickers did the hard sales pitch of asking, so would you like a sword as well? Swine. The third example doesn't come from my collection at all. I have a couple of blades which are possibly, maybe even probably original, but they're way past my late medieval, early modern comfort zone and were bought as gifts from antique shops. So instead, I've used the excellent online references which the Royal Armoury provides and chose the first example of a sword from Britain which came up. In this case, an officer's sword of the Shropshire Yeomanry Cavalry. There's an assortment of bibliographical information with it and a wonderful link to contact someone to find out more. However, beautiful as it is, and it is a beautiful sword, I don't think anybody would doubt its realness. So, for me at least, there is a difference between a reenactment reproduction, something designed to be used against other people in a relatively safe manner, and a replica made to be as close to possible as an original and to an original piece. However, depending on what I'm doing, which hat I'm wearing, I'd be happy to say that any or all of them are real. Not without qualifications perhaps, but all possess some quality of realness. I think all three are real, just for different definitions, slightly different definitions in some cases, of real. One thing though, I'm sometimes told by people they own a real sword, and a bit of investigation can show that it's perhaps an original or a reenactment blade, a sharp or semi-sharp replica. So it could be a family heirloom, something passed down from you know, father to son or grandfather to uncle or what have you, which has seen use. It could be that it's a legacy item from somebody that used to be a reenactor or whose relative or friend used to be a reenactor. Or quite commonly, it's something that is based on a prop from, say, Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the next sword-based show that captures people's imagination is. And sometimes, particularly in the hands of a younger person, it's a wooden, plastic or rubber sword. But to them, it has some element of reality. Perhaps it's worth qualifying or clarifying the quality of realness then. If I've got a variety of blades, some of which are sharp and some of which are reenactment blunts, I'll be really honest. If someone asks, is that a real sword? Yes, though this one is heavy and has a thick blade for practice, so I can avoid hurting people by accident when training. On balance though, I think I would actually go slightly further than Professor Lipscomb. Speaking as a historical interpreter and heritage professional, interested in engaging in public history and engaging with people, that sometimes a reproduction is more real than the real thing. A replica reproduction somebody can physically interact with, have a personal, intimate experience with, sometimes has more value than an original artifact which they cannot. Again, to quote Professor Lipscomb, creating something that is experientially authentic means that our interpretation needs to appeal to as many of the senses as possible. The Tudor kitchens at Hampton Court were reinterpreted in 2006 with this aim in mind. Fresh from the front end evaluation, the team wanted to remove the existing rope barriers and allow visitors to touch everything. The irony was this meant removing many real objects to display them elsewhere and replacing them with replica items. This is perhaps part of the reason why some historic sites and heritage attractions include original pieces in their handling collection or within their educational offering, be it bricks, bottles, badges or blades, because the impact that getting hands-on with pieces of the past has can be enormous. I'm sure I'm not alone in seeing the look of glee on a person's face, be they 6, 36 or 106, when they're able to touch something historical, be it original or reproduction, and to experience that moment, certainly real for them, which brings them into the historical past. For me, and in my experience, that opportunity to get hands-on with a replica or reproduction or original can be incredibly powerful and can provide a transformative moment for some people, something that can spark what could be a lifelong interest in the lives of people in the past, or just be really cool. All of which avoids the point of the question. What does "is it a real sword" mean? So I'm going to again borrow somebody's words, in this case Sue, from a response to a blog post entitled 7 Stupid Things Asked of Historical Reenactors. Sue wrote, "Some of the questions are really ridiculous and asked by people with no common sense or who just don't have a clue. Others, though, whilst ridiculous and irritating to you, are being asked by non-experts. We haven't researched the error, but I would actually like to know the answers to some of these questions. Perhaps there is a better way to ask them. The real sword question. Let's face it, we live in a world where entertainment and even education comes in the form of props. A prop sword can look very real, but be better at mushing butter than slicing it. Perhaps a better question is whether the sword is preserved from its era or is a recreation. And I think in some ways that surmises some of my ramblings quite well. What is the question, is it a real sword, asking? Well, often, and usually I would say, it's a conversational gambit, an opening, a way of expressing interest. Sue is interested in the sword, or the fire, or the food, or the baby, or whatever the subject whose realness has been challenged, or questioned, or merely inquired about might be. There is, among some historical interpreters and reenactors, the tendency, as in the article I mentioned, to be somewhat sneering or somehow smugly superior to the general public because of the questions they are sometimes, even often, asked. And I get it, I really do, but making the mental change, the translation from this fool is asking whether the food I'm eating is real or whether wearing wool in the blazing August sun is hot, to this person is interested in the food I'm eating or the clothes I'm wearing, is actually, I think, really, really important. It's important for making sure people feel welcomed at a reenactment event. It's really important for making sure visitors are comfortable having a great experience at your heritage site, collection, museum, historic property, library, shopping centre, car park, or wherever. It's vital when offering an educational or interpretive experience, and it's something to think about when training volunteers, staff, or briefing freelancers. I should note, this is my first time in a while since I've been at the Royal Armouries, and as a side note, didn't actually get a chance to go around a lot of it, but I did get to do some handling. It was amazing. So it's entirely possible my thoughts on the Royal Armouries will be unfair or unrepresentative of the current interpretation strategy. But as an impressive collection of real swords on display, I think it's worth spending a moment revisiting a couple of my earlier points and using the magnificent collection at the Royal Armouries as an illustration. See, it has a wide variety of original weapons on display behind glass, a perfectly normal, useful, safe way to display potentially dangerous and vulnerable, delicate items. I can't be the only person to have failed to notice little finger marks on metals and putting something away, and you discover the vile rust has breached itself at some point in the future. It's a very normal, excellent example of museum craft, the likes of which can be found any number of places. It also contains a great display of arms and armour in a very traditional style, mounted on walls in martial array, a spectacle and an artistic expression of deadly beauty. And I'm specifically thinking of the Hall of Steel at the Royal Armouries. It reflects both the ideal of aristocratic weapons upon the wall and how many historic properties and stately homes do display martial objects. There are displays of arms and armour in use on mannequins, both human and horse, elephant, behind barriers and sometimes behind glass, providing a visceral impression and understanding of how things might have looked and how it might have felt to come face to face with a pikeman or a mounted knight. I recall some very dramatic dioramas which demonstrate a truth of how weapons, including real swords, might have been used. And finally, the Royal Armoury has an excellent live interpretation programme with individual performances, and I remember very evocative monologues of an archer on the eve of battle, and group work. Similarly evocative was a couple of people discussing and demonstrating the use of longsword. And whilst I haven't been lucky enough to take part or to see them, large-scale interpretations in the tilt yard are a well-known spectacle and add all sorts of sensory reality to a visit. Sounds and smells as well as sight and touch. So lots of different ways that people might encounter a Royal Armouries sword. And frankly, I'd argue that the reproduction longsword's been waved around or the replica falchion drawn and flourished on a point are as real in experiential terms as the original blades high on a wall or behind glass, sort of. So how do you answer the question, is it a real sword then? I would suggest it depends on the circumstances, but I would always recommend being honest. And as an aside, I always recommend people faced with a question they don't know, answer that question honestly. Most of the times people ask questions because they want to know the answer. Sometimes they just want to show off. And regardless, spreading guesses as truth is really a good plan. I will happily enough make an educated guess, but I'll make it clear that's what I'm doing. I'm not certain, but I imagine this is the case, or it could be that this. So answering the question will depend on circumstances and situation. And it can be a different challenge when you're in a first person role rather than being third person talking about something, and knowing when and how to switch between those is beyond the scope of this paper, this presentation, but it is a skill which I recommend interpreters get beneath their period appropriate belt. In short though, saying yes but is a good start. So how might I answer? Well, as a reenactor or historical interpreter or an educator with reenactment blade, I might give the answer yes, but this is a practice blade made for training, so it's heavier than a live sharp blade and blunted so I can avoid hurting my fellows. With a replica or reproduction, I might say yes, that this is a modern recreation, which works fine for third person but not so much for first, where I might say yes, made only a year or two ago, new forged for this fight or similar. For an original piece, establishing the authenticity is, I think, really important, particularly when people are handling something that has the weight of actual history within its materiality. If you know where it was made or by who, then mention that, or where it was found, which collection it's from, or it might be as simple as saying yes, this sword was actually used, was actually made during the fighting. So a bit of a side and a few thoughts as to how to answer the question, but in all cases, in all points, I have been saying yes. All of which brings me in a slightly wobbly fashion back to my original question: is it a real sword? Well, hopefully my thoughts are useful. Notably that real means different things to different people in different situations and circumstances, and that a replica or reproduction which somebody can have an intimate personal experience with can be just as real as an original artifact behind glass, and that experience is, I think, the ultimate reality, and that for those who are involved in interpretation or reenactment or educational or simply work front of house in a heritage attraction or a historic property, something that contains swords or, other artifacts, it can simply be a way of expressing interest or be an opening conversational gambit. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you didn't question the nature of reality too strongly. If you've got any questions about the topics or themes that I raised, please feel free to ask them down below. If you liked it, please do like it. If you want to see more, please do subscribe, and if you think that will be useful to somebody, please feel free to share it. Meanwhile, there's more videos to be coming, so take care, stay safe, stay happy, stay historical.